Hello again from the USM 7th floor Glickman Library, the USM Portland Library and Glickman Library, 7th floor. This is the second, perhaps the last of the preliminary background videos that I'm making as I get ready for Being and Learning 2.0, which begins next week. Today is the 7th of February, and the experiment 2.0 gets underway on Wednesday, I believe. Oh, maybe it's Thursday, actually. The 13th of February, yes, that's Thursday. And in this preliminary video, I'd like to make a couple comments about my understanding of meditation and phenomenology, which is to say that the methodology that I undertook in the experiment was what I call poetic phenomenological meditations. So something needs to be said about meditation, and something needs to be said about my understanding of meditation, but not an excessive amount. It's just context. So just to backtrack, the experiment, as I've detailed in writing in the prefatory material to Being and Learning, the book that was published by Sense Publisher in 2012, and this comment in brief is also made on the blog that's devoted to this experiment and more, it turns out. It's become just my blog in general. But the focus and the original intent of the blog is the returning to the original experiment. And the original experiment was born out of a certain frustration that I felt with regard to the work that I was doing as a philosopher. And I say philosopher because at the time, after I'd completed my dissertation, which I still felt very much so was an expression of concerns I had, big, what I call in the other preliminary video, big questions or fundamental questions. I think my dissertation was very much an attempt to engage with those bigger questions, particularly questions of justice, or the overlap between the questions of justice, social justice in particular, and philosophical questions of the sort of primary form, specifically the question of freedom. But after that, once I got into academia, once I had the license to then practice, if you will, in academia, I found myself on tenure track, and I found myself under the expectations of publishing and presenting at conferences. And I must say I struggled with that process because it was demanding a certain type of writing, a certain type of secondary writing. Yes, everybody who's gone through or is going through the process of getting tenure, particularly in the social sciences and humanities, knows that the work that we do and the writing that we do is, for the most part, secondary. When we want to put it in positive terms, we call it special, meaning that it's the result of our specialized interest or field of study, but it is secondary by design. That is to say, we study and write on primary works, and this is very much the case in philosophy education, which is the field of study and scholarship, not to mention the teaching field of teaching that I found myself in when I completed my PhD at the New School for Social Research in philosophy. So having gone through a period of the tenure process and getting tenure, I sort of came out of it like perhaps many people do, but I can only speak for myself, which is to say, with a mixture of satisfaction, elation, having managed to complete something and achieve something that I'd set out to do, but also with a certain sense of disappointment or dissatisfaction with the work, the project, the style, the form in particular. I got into philosophy, as I said, and have said frequently, because of the way it touched me. I felt called to work on fundamental or primary questions, and so being called to do that, I felt myself to be not someone who should be doing secondary work, but that should be doing primary work. And that's not expressing a sentiment of arrogance or anything of the sort. It's just the nature of how I understood philosophy and what I believe philosophy to be. And so when I sat down to do the experiment in 2004, it really came from this place, from my heart, which remained what it was, even if my thinking or my mind had been shifted away from those questions. And I sat down to take up primary questions, and I sat down to think about primary questions. All that to say, of course, that, and this is part of my training at the New School and at Fordham that I retained, that sort of tradition of doing hermeneutics and exegesis, that is to say, the study of other text, which isn't the same as saying the study of primary text that places you in the relationship of being secondary. So there's a difference there for me. And I have mentioned Sam Rocha before, and I'll mention him again. I think Sam, in talking about being and learning, and he makes this point in his commentary that's was videotaped and put on the blog, and he says that what you do in your work is that you bring these sources that you use into conversation, right? So they're interlocutors with you. They are your dialogic partners. So I really believe that that's the difference between working on a particular thinker, working on a particular philosopher, and producing secondary or specialized research or literature, and having and entering into conversation with these first or primary thinkers. So in this sense, primary or first for me is really a temporal, first in time. They came before me. They were the ones who initiated the dialogue, the conversation. It's their language that established the first terms of the discussion, and so I enter into that conversation later, have to get a sense of what they're talking about, understand the terms they're using, and then start to add my own. And that's what really, in a sense, being and learning in the meditations are all about, and the phenomenology. So I'll jump to the phenomenological, and my sense of the phenomenological, and what I mean by the poetic as well, because I call them poetic phenomenological meditations. And the phenomenological or phenomenology, to go back to its sort of roots as a word and as a concept, it really comes out of the word phenom, right, to appear. And so phenomenology is the study of the way things appear. Phenomenology is the study of the way things appear. So Edmund Husserl famously said, let's return to the things themselves. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means in a moment. But essentially, it means that the phenomenology is placing an emphasis on things, ideas, for me, ideas, and first and foremost, studying them in their appearance. So what does that mean? Well, one way of understanding phenomenology is to understand it as a descriptive work. Right? So it is an attempt to describe the way something is appearing. Right? So it's descriptive. In my case, I call the work that I'm doing poetic phenomenology because the description or the way that I'm describing what I'm studying, what's appearing to me, and for me, and what was appearing were questions and ideas that were emerging from a selection of particular text, and the texts that were selected all emerged from one question that I posed that sort of initiated the entire project. And the question came from Plato, and it came from his Republic. And in his Republic, in book 6, I believe it is, Plato says, the challenge is not so much one of giving or enabling sight in eyes that cannot see. Rather, the challenge is one of turning around those eyes, that is to say, the mind's eye, or our perception, our capacity to think is even better, to turn around our capacity to think, which we have, toward the proper perception of being. So, what initiated the project was this statement by Plato that is suggesting that every one of us has this capacity to think. Every one of us has this capacity to think being. But the challenge or the question is being turned around toward that perception, or being turned around, or what I said turned on, or what I call turning on, being turned on to use language that I'm comfortable with, being turned on to thinking. So how is it that we're turned on to thinking? How is it that we're turned on to philosophy? How is it that we're turned away from or turned around from the concerns of everyday life, domestic life, the busyness of our everyday life? How are we turned away from that and turned on to thinking? That's the question. That's the question I pursued. And I pursued it by thinking about and allowing Plato to speak to me and responding to him, and then Heidegger, lots of Heidegger, some Arendt, some Nietzsche, Aristotle, Heraclitus, Lao Tzu, and many others. So that one question, though, was the question that first appeared to me. And I really have to emphasize that it really did appear to me, and it called me. And so the beginning of the work, the introduction, which was originally a paper I wrote and presented at the Philosophy of Education Society that was held every year at the New College in Oxford, PESGB, I presented that as a paper. That became the introduction. And then I went on to take up this question. And it was in the question itself that I turned to every day. So the daily experiment then is it is an attempt to do just that. And that's the meditation part of it. The meditation is an attempt to turn away from every day, turn away from the every day, turn away from the everyday, to turn away from the domestic concerns. And by domestic, I don't mean family and home, although clearly that is part of it, but it isn't what I'm reducing domestic to. Because the domestic is, I'm using it in the perhaps wider sense of being domesticated. And I talk a bit about that in the book, and that will be coming up in the meditations at some point when I revisit them. Domestication, and here in some respects I'm relying on the philosopher Paulo Freire, the Brazilian philosopher Paulo Freire, who talks about domestication as a form of oppression. So being domesticated means, well, what it says. It's, domesticated animals, for example. When we think about domesticated animals, the wildness over time removed from animals, or just the reproduction of animals for our needs, labor, and consumption. In what sense has education become a domain of domestication? In what sense has learning become domesticated? Can we regain the wild side of learning? So when I say turning away from the domestic, I mean turning away from a sphere of domestication, of doing domesticated philosophy of education. So every day turning away from that sphere, turning away from that logic and its expectations, and addressing the question, or rather, having the question address me, and allowing the question to address me. And by allowing or attempting to allow the question to address me, I was attempting to enact this turn. So the meditation is a turn. It is a return to thinking. It is a turning away from and a turn to. Audaciously, yes, it is a turn towards being. And each day that I turned away from the domestic or the domesticated realm of human affairs and towards thinking, towards being, each day something new emerged. Something new happened. And because it was phenomenological, my writing was an attempt to document that. But the writing itself, in documenting it, expresses this new thing that's emerging. So in this way it became poetic. Only a poetic writing could capture this fluid, spontaneous, improvisational way or character that thinking was allowing for. In a sense, what I'm saying is that the documentation of this flow of thinking had to be done in such a way that it would express the new, the flux that I found myself in every day. So it was a meditation in the sense of being contemplative. In my notes here, I put contemplation as a form of beholding. Contemplation as reception. Contemplation as observation. So contemplation is the kind of phenomenology I was engaged in. Phenomenology takes on many forms, but a phenomenological approach to the existential question of being, or the first question is the question of being. A phenomenological approach to that, for me, entails contemplation. And in order to undertake this particular kind of contemplation, because there are other forms of contemplation too, in order to undertake this contemplation, I needed to engage in meditation. And what distinguishes meditation is it's pretty straightforward. Singularity. One can only meditate by undertaking what Arendt calls the dialogue with oneself. M-A-M-auto. The silent dialogue with the self. I suppose it's possible to meditate alongside other people, although I would argue this kind of meditation that I was undertaking, or this kind of meditation that you undertake when you sit down and you write, and you document the flow of thinking each day for a certain period of time, and that's very important for me to reiterate that it happened for a certain particular amount of time, about an hour. That the exercise, doing this exercise, really requires you to be in a space by yourself. You need a room, relatively quiet. You need the time, fix the time, and that wasn't easy. But that wasn't always the case. Some of the meditations happened in cafes. In August of that year, I did a series of meditations when I was abroad in Madrid. Sounds romantic. It was indeed, but it happened. That summer as well, a lot of the meditations took place while I was camping. Again, sounds romantic. It was. But that's where it was. It wasn't always taking place in a study or in a library or in a room somewhere in a university. It happened every day, somewhere. But in each case, every day, I found the time and place to withdraw into this dialogue with myself. Now, I want to say that the meditations I undertook were different from two forms of meditations that were sort of popular in the history of philosophy. One of those being René Descartes' meditations on first philosophy. And what distinguishes Descartes' meditations and his style, what he was doing, and the one I was undertaking, was that Descartes had a goal in mind, a specific aim in mind. And that was to arrive at a foundation. And to doubt his way, doubting the senses and the body and all that it offers us, to arrive at the clarity of the mind. And my project and my meditations were anything but the sort. I like to say that I appreciate and very much am comfortable with, if not embrace, the messy. And so, whereas Descartes' project had a certain goal in mind, mine was closer to what Foucault talks about when he talks about the hermeneutics of the self and the tradition of what he calls spirituality, which is not what it may sound like, but means the ongoing preparation and working on the self. So the ongoing preparation for an encounter with the truth. So in my other video, I talk about, use a rent to talk about the distinction between being and becoming, and how we are as humans in the flux of becoming, but always related to being. So if there is certainly not an endpoint, but some truth that the meditations are related to, it is being. And so each day the project, the meditations, were really an attempt to prepare for, in the sense of exercise. So they're different from Descartes insofar as I wasn't trying to get through the messiness and get through the illusion of this or that or the other thing, but it was to move in the realm of becoming. I don't know that I did a very good job of distinguishing myself from Descartes, but that's one important example of a meditation. The other one that's a bit older goes back to the Stoics, Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, among others. And in those cases, the meditations that they were undertaking were a bit closer to what I'm up to, except they were much more, in some sense, phenomenological, because they were much more engaged with everyday life. So phenomenology in the sense of being grounded in everyday life, in that sense of phenomenology. But the Stoic tradition of meditation is, for me anyway, mostly about trying to arrive at a moral understanding of the world. So the Stoic withdraws into meditation, takes a time to separate themselves from their everyday life, and in doing so is trying to understand the best way to rejoin that life. So the Stoic meditation is an attempt to either early in the morning or late in the evening take the time to reflect on the day's events and to understand how one can best rejoin those events in a way that will connect the self to this greater moral order that's in the world. So the presumption is that, again, in the way that I'm presuming being, the Stoics are presuming logos, or an ethical order to things, and the meditations they undertake are an attempt to understand how they can act in such a way that they are a reflection of that moral order, which is to say connected to that moral order. Not such a bad thing, but this is not my project. So my meditations are not about arriving at an understanding of the moral order and or how one can best connect to that moral order. So in the end, the work is much more a work of poetics, in the sense of what you have in the end is something that I've made my writing is something that I've made, and what I've made is a philosophical work, which is a documentation of my encounter with being, with my being underlined and bold-faced insofar as I'm really taking ownership and responsibility for it, but I can't claim to be speaking for anyone but myself. And therein is the sort of Kierkegaardian spirit that I was working in, for sure, at the time when I started this. I was in part influenced by the Danish philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, as well as the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And what Kierkegaard and Nietzsche taught me, or what I learned from them, was to appreciate and to really rejoice in this sense of being an author. And so authority being authorship and taking responsibility for one's thinking. So in the work, I'm very clear, or at least I had in mind, or I was always understanding that what I'm offering and what I'm doing is, in the end, a deeply existential piece of work. And this is why my colleague Sam Rocha, who I've mentioned a couple times now, describes the work as a work of self-disclosure. My other colleague, Tyson Lewis, talks about it as a kind of an epic. If it's an epic, it's an epic in which I'm both the storyteller as well as the hero, right? I'm the one, I'm the Odysseus. So in a certain sense, I'm like, it's a work that is probably something like Dante's Inferno. Of course, it's the Divine Comedy, and I am in no way likening this work of mine to Dante's Divine Comedy or to Homer's Odyssey. This is not my point. My point is just to give examples of two epics that most of us are familiar with, and to talk about one as a model for me. Dante's is a model for me insofar as Dante was both a character in his Divine Comedy as well as the writer or the narrator, right? So there's Dante the character and there's Dante the narrator. So I'm saying that for me, I never appeared as a person in the book, but the person that undertook the meditations is all, in the end, that this book can speak from and for and to. That others who pick up the book can hear something that resonates with them, or they might find certain aspects of it interesting or compelling. They want to respond to it. They want to come into the conversation with me that I'm having with so many philosophers and writers that I found important. That's my hope. But I'm not claiming to be doing metaphysics, which is to say I'm not claiming to be offering up a systemized account of being, nor am I claiming to be offering up a systemized account of how we can build a philosophy of education that will be metaphysical in its orientation. That is to say, a philosophy of metaphysical education, if that makes any sense. Rather, I am offering my own daily meditations, experimentations with thinking that I have published or had published, was able to publish in their complete form, with obviously having edited them, but from beginning to end, so to speak. And yeah. So they're poetic. The writing is poetic, rather. These meditations, these daily experiments in turning away from the domestic and to thinking. They are phenomenological because they are, the method I'm following is a documentary one. It's something equivalent to recording. And I think the last thing I'll say is that in the way that recently I've really become enamored with this form, this media of recording visual and audio via the software that Google has put out there with YouTube, in the way that I become, and this wasn't available to me, I may have done it this way and there may have been no book in the end, and this may have been the preferable way to go, because in some respects I'm more of an oral person and I come from an oral tradition. Nevertheless, in the same way that I've become sort of enamored with this form, I approach my writing as a form of recording. And so I had, for many years, been fascinated with the recording, the art of recording, of audio recording in particular, and that's why I do radio work, and the radio work I do is radio work that is focused on the Grateful Dead and all the recordings that were done of their live performances. So if there's one last thing I'll say, is the simile that I guess would be most useful for understanding my writing is to say that my writing is something akin to recording, taping a session in a studio, taping a live performance. My writing is that. Right? So I think that might be the best simile. It's useful, and that's the way to think about the writing, if and when you ever have the opportunity, whomever you are, to read the book or some aspect of Being and Learning. Thanks for listening.